As intriguing as they are, complex systems aren't quite as special as complex adaptive systems. These are a special case of complex systems. What makes them adaptive is that the individual and collective behaviors of the system mutate and self-organize in ways that tend to preserve the larger structure. There are three features that are central to how a complex adaptive system works: diversity and novelty, selection from among that diversity, and amplification of what has been selected. Diversity is needed for selection because you can't make a meaningful selection unless there are different things from which you can choose. And novelty is required to preserve diversity for reasons that will be clear after we've looked at amplification. For selection, there has to be some criterion or multiple criteria by which some elements are chosen over others. In evolution, the basic selection criterion is survival and successful reproduction. Successful is defined relative to others using the same resources. You have to do better than other individuals in your species or other species in your environment. For amplification, imagine a species with 4 different variants, A, B, C, and D. Every generation, some of them die out without reproducing, but they differ in how likely they are to meet that fate. In the first generation we're looking at, all of the A's die out, 3 of the B's, but only 1 each of the C's and the D's. And let's say that while C and D have the same survival rate, D was more successful at having offspring, so the 3 survivors from D produce 8 offspring, while the 3 survivors from C only produce 6, and the 1 surviving B has a pair of offspring. Our second generation now has 8 D's, 6 C's, only 2 B's, and no A's at all. In the third generation, D is more successful than C at surviving, and each of the survivors is a more prolific breeder. Our third generation has 11 D's, 5 C's, and nothing else. Success in this game is defined as surviving to reproductive age and having offspring. In the given environment, D was better at those things than the other types, and D was naturally amplified from being 25% of the population to being almost 70% of it. This is why you need novelty. As you select a few successful types and amplify them, you reduce diversity. So without novelty, you'd end up with no variety from which to choose. Note that in evolution, amplification overlaps with selection. You're selected by doing a better job surviving and reproducing. By reproducing more than others, you're being amplified. To the extent that behaviors and physical traits are shaped by genes, genetic inheritance makes it likely that the traits selected in one generation are still there in the next. So we have our basic CAS mechanism, and we can connect this structure of evolutionary success to gradients, and through them to the maximum power principle. Since living things are dissipative structures, being alive requires using a gradient. To utilize it, you first have to find and capture it. Success is based on being relatively good at finding a gradient, for instance, locating prey, capturing it, such as successful hunting, and utilizing it. An example would be efficiently digesting what you captured and effectively using what you got from digesting. Now recall the maximum power principle. During self-organization, system designs develop and prevail that maximize power intake, energy transformation, and those uses that reinforce production and efficiency. If you do a better job of finding, capturing, and utilizing gradients, you are maximizing your chance of making it into the next generation. In other words, you're increasing your chance of being evolutionarily successful. But it turns out you're also fulfilling one or more parts of the maximum power principle. You're maximizing your intake, your use, or the efficiency of your use, which means that biological evolution can be seen as an expression of the maximum power principle. That's the big picture. At a more detailed level, the result is some amazing technologies, such as symbiotic relationships, massive decentralized coordination, trickery, adaptation to changed circumstances, and energy harvesting. Mycorrhizal fungi are fungi that at one end grow into plant roots, while their other end grows out into the soil. But they're not parasites harming the plant. Rather, they're very effective at gathering nutrients from the soil and transporting them back to the roots of the plant for the plant to use. It's not that they're altruistic. The plant provides sugars that help the fungi grow. In a sense, the mycorrhizae trade nutrients for sugars, and both species benefit. There are termite species in parts of Africa and South America that build gigantic above-ground mounds. The mounds are wonders of engineering. The fins on their sides help to radiate heat, while the shape and the passages inside them help move air to keep the colony well ventilated. The hundreds of thousands of termites aren't led by an architect, general, president, or even a foreman. The queen isn't a ruler, but just a giant egg-laying machine. Instead of obeying a leader, each individual follows genetically coded behaviors to respond to its environment, temperature, airflow, and so on. But those individual behaviors interact so as to create large structures that embody complex engineering principles. Nature is also full of trickery. This is a flower that looks enough like a bee that a worker bee will try to mate with it. These are flowers that look like luscious, sugar-filled berries that a bird would want to eat, but they're merely shiny, not sweet. There are also remarkable adaptations to changed circumstances. For instance, antibiotics work by getting into a bacterium and somehow interfering with its normal functioning. But bacteria develop various kinds of resistance. Sometimes it's an enzyme that breaks down the antibiotic. Sometimes it's an enzyme that clings to the antibiotic, thus altering its function. And it can even be a pump that removes the molecules of the antibiotic from the cell. We'll wrap up our survey of technologies in evolution with a candidate for life's blockbuster innovation, photosynthesis. Life existed before the evolution of photosynthesis. There was roughly the same amount of sunlight falling on the earth as there is today, and it heated the land, evaporated water, and powered weather. But without photosynthesis, there was no path by which it could power life. Organisms lived by harvesting the energy in the chemical bonds of some molecules, but it was a pretty paltry stream of energy, and so, like the limited life forms within the dark of a cave, life on Earth was less abundant and diverse than today. The change came with chlorophyll, a molecule that allowed plants to capture sunlight. With access to a much larger energy source, life became more abundant and diverse. There's something that each of these technologies has in common. Each innovation is a better way of finding or capturing or utilizing some gradient. Which brings us back to where we started the chapter, with inanimate structures like convection and hurricanes. In the presence of a strong enough gradient of the right kind, these dissipative structures take shape, and when the gradient disappears, the structure likewise melts away. Something similar is true of ecosystems. In the presence of the right kind of gradient, living forms may emerge and evolve toward greater use of the available gradient. A stronger gradient supports a more abundant and diverse ecosystem. And if the gradient disappears, the ecosystem comes to a screeching halt as well. In other words, an ecosystem, like a hurricane, is a dissipative structure. But it's also a complex adaptive system, always coming up with new ways of building gradients up and new ways of dissipating them. That wraps up our overview of ecology. In the next chapter, we'll start tweaking our model of an ecosystem to turn it into a model of the physical workings of the economy.